Hi, I am that guy, Douglas Hall, and this is my YouTube series, What If? And the topic is, what if the Russian Empire won the Russo-Japanese War? Now, before I get started, I'm just going to apologize in advance if I mispronounce something or if I might have offended anyone. Like I said, I'm apologizing in advance, which I will say throughout the course of the video. Now, this is about a conflict that started 113 years ago. Now, before I get started with the topic, we'll talk about my personal notes and a brief background of the subject. Now, let's get started. So, my personal notes with this subject is that since I am Korean, the war was basically the final historical event that determined Korea's fate as a unified nation, which eventually led to the Korean division of Korea as it is, believe it or not. Now, let's get into a brief background into the Russo-Japanese War. The Russian Empire was slowly expanding into Asia since Peter the Great, but their efforts in East Asia only accelerated after Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War, and Russia needed a warm water port in the Pacific, which can be found in China or in Korea. Their interest was primarily in Manchuria, but at Korea to an extent. Russia eventually made plans to annex Manchuria due to railroads and the lucrative economic interest in Manchuria. And they also seek similar economic interest in Korea as well. And they also formed an alliance with France in 1892. As for the Empire of Japan, they modernized successfully after being opened up to foreign powers after the United States in 1852. And they needed natural resources and national security. Much of this can be found in Korea. Resources and security alike, especially since the dwindling Qing dynasty had an effect throughout East Asia. Japan wanted Korea to be either independent or under their influence for the most part, and eventually they formed an alliance with Great Britain in 1902. Alright then, before we get down into it, let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of both empires. Let's start with the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire's advantages: they had a large population and a very large economy, and on the move of industrialization, along with a large army and navy and vast territories. Now, their disadvantage is that Russia's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness: its size, territorially speaking. And their military is spread throughout the Russian Empire's territories, and most of the equipment, industry, military population is in Europe. And another disadvantage is they had incompetent leaders, particularly military leaders. Let's move on to the Empire of Japan. Their advantages: they have a better equipped army and navy, and they have better military leaders and a shorter range of transportation. It's easier for something to be transported from Japan to the front lines in Asia than it is for Russia to transport something from Europe to Asia, which is where the front lines is at. Now, their disadvantage is they had weaker finances. Before the war, Russia and Japan didn't have good finances to begin with. However, Japan was already in a poor state of finance than Russia is. And by the war, Japan was actually almost on the verge of bankruptcy before the war ended. Alright, let's take a look at some pictures of charts, maps, and so on and so forth regarding the conflict. This is Russia's Trans-Siberian Railway, which connects Vladivostok with Moscow. Now, as you can see here, it's pretty long, but yet impressive at the time, especially the time between one stop to another until eventually you reach the end or the other. But as you notice, on the Russian Manchurian area, which is Russian soil that they took from China in 1860, that it was originally meant to be built there, but when they got the concession to build the Chinese Eastern Railway, it definitely provided a shortcut to Vladivostok, and when they added the railroad to Port Arthur, then it made everything more perfect as well. Shorter the distance, shorter the travel. But the thing is, the Trans-Siberian Railway was only partly finished, like I said earlier. Now this is a chart between the various strengths between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, it looked like the odds were in Russia's favor. But, like I said earlier, most of Russia's military, population, and industry was in Europe. Very little of that was in Asia, so transporting all that was not easy. And, as you can see in this photo, it looked like Russia even built a railroad on top of that frozen lake in order to transport units or supplies faster. And when the ice melted, there you go. Alright, let's get into what happened during the course of the war and the pretext that led to it. The Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire, they tried to negotiate to avoid war, but they had different opinions of how to do that, which led to the talks unlikely successful. Japan proposed to Russia that they can have all of Manchuria in exchange for Korea. Russia counter-proposed by making northern Korea at the 39th parallel and above as a neutral buffer zone. But in the end, like I said, talks led to nothing. But it also looked like both nations were preparing for war as well. Japan was building up its navy, and Russia was slowly putting in troops into Manchuria and even parts of northern Korea as well, even though they say they were supposed to withdraw from Manchuria as an agreement from the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. Now, Japan started the war by attacking Port Arthur, although Russia won the battle, but it was pointless considering it covered a Japanese invasion of Korea at Incheon, thus to a full Japanese occupation of Korea. Now, Korea tried to be neutral, but the historical geopolitics didn't make that possible. While Korea did have a modern army, but it was small, so it was not enough to protect their neutrality or their independence. Now, Russia's strategy during the course of the war was to delay time as much as possible so that way their reinforcements can arrive. Japan's strategy during the course of the war was to win before a significant amount of Russian reinforcements will arrive in time, because even though Japan had a good-sized army at the time, but the Russian army was far superior in number. So even though the Russian army was relatively outdated in terms of equipment, but a large army with at least decent arms, I mean, that's pretty hard, to stop against. Now, when Japan won the Battle of Yalu River in 1904, it proved that the war was not going to be short, and they're not an easy nation that can be beaten so easily. Now, the Russian morale, it decreased with each battle, especially after the loss of Port Arthur, after the siege of Port Arthur, which lasted at least 6 months. Although Japan won the siege, but it was not an easy victory. They lost countless lives in comparison. Then, finally, when Japan won the battle at Mukden, which is near modern-day Shenyang in Manchuria, it ended Russia's military capacity on the land. And finally, the Battle of Tsushima is what finally ended the Russo-Japanese War. Russia, since the start of the war, or roughly, they decided to send the majority of their Baltic fleet from Europe to the Pacific. But the thing is, they had to travel 80,000 miles. So basically, Europe, around Africa, Asia, and finally, to the front line. Now, the thing is, after the fall of Port Arthur, they had to get to Vladivostok at this point. But Japan knew that the fleet was coming, but they just didn't know when it was going to come or what route they were going to take. But finally, they caught up with the Baltic fleet, and the destruction of the Baltic fleet essentially ended Russia's final hope to stay in the war. So that's the course of the Russo-Japanese War. Now, we have to talk about what was the original outcome of the Russo-Japanese War. Because Japan won, Russia lost much of its status as a global great power, and Japan emerged as a great power. And also, Russia's foreign policy, their main attention was now focused back into Europe, and Russia's defeat also lowered the risk to Great Britain, which allowed them to form the Triple Entente against the Triple Alliance. And it also influenced Germany to develop the Schlieffen Plan for World War I. And, like I said, since Japan emerged as a great power on the global stage, they were able to acquire Port Arthur and later annex Korea, which will eventually lead to the division of Korea after the Sino-Japanese War, which the Russo-Japanese War also led to, thus World War II, thus war with the USA, thus division of Korea. So essentially, the Russo-Japanese War opened up Japan's expansion throughout the rest of Asia, and then World War II, and finally into the modern era as we know it today. So believe it or not, the Russo-Japanese War was the first major regional conflict that had a global implication. I think I know what you're thinking. How could Russia would have done differently throughout the course of the war that would have allowed them to win? One, if Russia sent troops into Korea. Because Russia allowed Japan to take over Korea so easily, granted they wanted to delay time for their troops, but it also gave Japan what they needed, basically a launching point to make their attacks more effectively into Manchuria. So if they sent troops into Korea, it would have done a better job of delaying Japan and reduced the risk at Port Arthur and the rest of their positions in Manchuria. Second, if Russia fought longer at Port Arthur. When Japan finally captured the Russian port at the Liaodong Peninsula, and I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly, but if not, again, I apologize. When they captured the port, the Japanese discovered there was a large stockpile of supplies, and it led them to believe that the Russians could have held out a lot longer. And if they did, it would have bottled up more of the Japanese army and possibly inflicted as much casualties or damage to the Japanese army and allowed more reinforcements to get into Manchuria or Vladivostok in time. Third, if Russia won the Battle of Mukden. Now, believe it or not, Japan's entire fighting strength was at Shenyang or at Mukden. So if Russia won, it would have dealt a serious blow to the Japanese army and their land capacity, and it will gradually allow Russia to get back into Port Arthur and even into Korea. Now, fourth reason, which is not out of the realm of the possibility if you think about it still. I mean, had some right decisions have been made properly, or if certain actions didn't happen, and so on and so forth. Anyway, the fourth reason is if Korea instead allied with the Russian Empire. Now, if Korea had modernized better, or at least had some decent sized army with and equipment, they could have helped Russia out by delaying Japan, much like how Belgium did for France during the First World War. Fifth reason is if Russian Admiral Stefan Markov survived instead. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but like I said, I apologize. He was the only best Russian military leader throughout the course of the war. Now, most of the Russian ships, especially the Pacific Fleet at the time of the start at the war, was mostly outdated compared to the Japanese ships. However, he was a great admiral. He actually could bring out the full potential and effectiveness of his ships. But when he was killed, then the Russian fleet, or the Russian Pacific Fleet, decided to stay at Port Arthur and decided just to stay in there and not risk themselves out. And so Russia lost their best admiral and their best military leader throughout the course of the war. And the final reason is if Russia fought longer in general throughout the course of the war. Like I said from earlier, that both nations' finances were not too great. And I also did mention that Japan was or likely near bankruptcy near the end of the war. So if Russia fought out longer, then Japan might have been forced to sue for peace or something like that more favorable to Japan because they were running short of money. Russia could still finance the war a lot better than Japan did. Alright, let's talk about several alternate outcomes as a result of what if Russia won the Russo-Japanese War. For one thing, Russia's primary foreign policy would primarily be in Asia, but they'll still keep an eye on Europe, but most of its attention will be on Europe. Eventually, Russia would annex Manchuria, or better known as Inner Manchuria, despite that the Qing dynasty would have a major problem with that, but as to why and how, that's another story. And Russia might have Korea as a protectorate at the very most, but it will definitely be under Russia's influence and still likely maintain some independence to a degree. And it will also strengthen the Tsar's position in his government. More likely or not, the State Duma of the Russian Empire may not be established, for one. And next, like I said earlier, Korea's independence would likely be maintained. It would not likely lead to the division of Korea as it was during the Cold War after World War II. Thus, there's no divisions of any kind except for regional based, like accents, for example, similar to China between the North and South, and the United States, same thing, North, South, East, West, like I said. And more than likely, the Korean Empire would likely be continued on to the present day, or alternate present day. And finally, Japan's expansion plans wouldn't be necessarily scrapped, but it'll definitely suffer a setback, that's for sure. And more likely than not, they'll have to likely make deals with Korea, equal trade and profits and deals for Korea, especially for their coal, iron, food, so on and so forth, like almost everything you can think of. Let me show you a map of what it might look like throughout the world, and especially Asia, if Russia won the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, that's pretty significant if you think about it. So, am I not wrong? Now, in terms of political ideologism and all that, believe it or not, as much as I don't like to admit it, but Japan beating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War actually did something psychological as well. Not just nationally, but locally as well, and globally. It proved that an Asian nation can beat a Western nation. Granted, it was the Russian Empire, nevertheless. The fact that Asia could beat the West, and it ended the mindset, Asians, particularly Asian nations, were inferior to Western nations, mainly because of what happened with the Qing dynasty since the Opium Wars. And in terms of politics, the 1905 Russian Revolution, it still occurred during the Russo-Japanese War, but had Russia won, then the movement wouldn't be so strong as it did in our history. And so we might actually see the Russian Empire around today, if you think about it. And Japan, they might realize that they might have to be equal and do better relations with other nations, especially with Korea. Now, more likely, I think this will strengthen the position of Ito Hirobumi, who, even though I'm Korean, I highly respected the man. He was the one man that could have made relations work, and he was the ideal Japanese leader during that time of history. Now, based on what I just talked about, and on my own research leading up to the video, it seems like that Russia could have defeated Japan in 1904, unlike China against Japan in 1894, just 10 years ago. So, what do you think? But I think that Russia had the land advantage, but Japan had the sea advantage. So it's kind of in the balance. If you think about it, it's just, you know, decisions, luck, and who knows. But you know what? I think I'm going to let you guys decide. The viewers. You guys should decide of who could have won, or if Russia could have won. Yes or not for Russia's victory. And I'll definitely do more information in the video description below. Please like and subscribe and share this information in the video with your friends. I look forward to your comments. Follow me on Twitter. And this is that guy, Douglas Hall, signing off. Unlike China against Japan just 9 years before the Russo-Japanese War, back in 1892. Cut. Manchuria and Korea to an extent. Also had a regional influence in cut there. And if you also noticed, it's unfinished on the Russian portion of Manchuria, so it won't be easy to send troops. Okay, cut. Manchuria, the region that Russia took during the 1600. Cut. 1860.